Can I make 2 points about that? You know, you talk about that we've just accepted it. I think that the media makes us think we've accepted it, right? Because I remember when the Iraq War was starting, it was the biggest protest in the history of the world against a war, and we barely saw it on television. Those jagoffs in their Manhattan TV news studio just drive through protests, then they go in their studio and not even fucking mention it. All right, so I think people are sick of it. I think that's what Bernie Sanders is all about. I think that's what people on both sides of the aisle are sick of this shit. And we see what's happening, and we see how our country is being run for the plutocracy. And if I can make one more point about nuclear war, because this gets overlooked, right? This whole thing that says that, I don't know, I forget what the stat was. It was over 50% of Americans think it was necessary. Well, the nuclear war, bombing Japan with nuclear weapons, totally not necessary. Not at all. We did it because we had that era's version of George Bush. We had a redneck, uneducated guy as the president, and he wanted to show off a little. Who knows why? Because everybody told him not to do it. You know who told him not to do it? I'll tell you who told him not to do it. General MacArthur told him not to do it. He didn't want it. He thought it was barbarian. His chief of staff to President Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, the guy named Admiral William D. Leahy, this is what he said about the nuclear war. He said, "It is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan." No material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and the successful bombing with conventional weapons. The lethal possibilities of atomic warfare in the future are frightening. My own feeling was that in being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make war in that fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children. And that was the chief of staff to FDR and Truman.
Yeah, and I've got quotes from Eisenhower and a number of other military advisors. It was the political leadership that decided to use it over the advice of the military leadership. And it was less about Japan and more about the Soviet Union.
Now, I've heard also that the Russians, by entering the fray against Japan specifically, made them panic that they were actually going to come and take pieces of Japan. So they were more worried about losing territory than they were about losing civilians, which they had lost already.
Who's they?
Japan. So the main reason for their surrender was that the Russians were coming to take their land, as opposed to civilian casualties, which, by the way, in the firebombing of Tokyo, they already had enormous civilian casualties. Now, the flip side to that is, what I've never been convinced of is, well, if we didn't need the nukes and they didn't make a difference, so people say, oh, okay, you know, they would have surrendered anyway. But we dropped one on Hiroshima, and they still didn't surrender.
Yeah. So I think it's really relevant to hear Jimmy read that, and I think in retrospect, you know, it is a shameful thing that we're the only country to use nuclear weapons. But I think it is unfair to presume that every reason for it at the time was not based in some belief that it was the quickest way to end the war. I think that there's a mountain of historical evidence to suggest that. It may have been the wrong decision, but they believed earnestly that this war, which consumed everybody's lives from 1941 on, that was the quickest way to end it.
So what I've heard in what I've read, and people say that wasn't the intent. The intent to drop those bombs wasn't to win that war, because all his military advisors had told him that Japan was looking for a way out anyway. They just needed a way to save face. And the reason why he didn't surrender after that first one was because their emperor was a maniac, right? That's why, because he needed to find a way to save face, and he couldn't find it, right? And so they hit it again. And that's when, so my point is that they were already looking for a way. The reason why we dropped those bombs was to send a message to Russia. It wasn't to win the war with Japan. It was to send a message to Russia, look what we got. Yeah. That's what that was about. So, and couldn't be a more horrible reason to do something like that. That's just barbarism.
Let me just say that, look, I think that there are definitely a number of factors, right? So did Truman want to send a message to Russia? Most historians seem to agree that yes, he did. But was that the sole reason he did it? Well, that's far from clear, right? And so now there's another interesting perspective, which actually, Ben, you and I haven't talked about this, but I read in your dad's book, right? So Ben's dad served in World War II, and the people who were serving in World War II were universally thrilled that we dropped the bomb. You know why? Otherwise, they might have died. And so we were going to send our soldiers over there. And Jimmy, you would make an excellent point, and I would make this point as well. Well, that's what soldiers are for, right? Rather than killing civilians. But if you're one of those soldiers, or you're the family of those soldiers, right? Well, you know, there was a lot of Americans who were like, let's wrap this thing up, okay?
We were gonna-
A lot of people have died. Millions upon millions have died.
Jimmy,
we
we
don't want any more of our guys to die.
Jimmy, we were going to invade Japan, and tens of thousands of Americans and Japanese civilians were going to be killed in what would be a bloody fight that we almost.
That's
certainly
what they say. That's the propaganda for why we did it. But
Propaganda,
that's not what MacArthur says.
I got it. I mean, there's like literally 10,000 history books written by actual presidential historians on this. So I got it. You make a point. Do we want to send a message to Russia? If that entered into it at all, that's terrible, because you could send that message by literally having some foreign minister and secretary of state underlings meet and take them out to a test site and say, this is what we got.
Yeah.
And we can drop it on Japan.
I'm just saying that our conventional wisdom, I understand that that's the conventional
But
wisdom.
there were
I'm saying
guys on
it's wrong.
troop ships. Those people were on troop ships.
No doubt.
So, I mean, and they were going, and we would have invaded if we didn't drop it. We weren't going to not invade Japan. We were trying to win that war, and that was the way to win it, is you invade the country.
So, like, why don't we just drop a nuke in Iraq then? Why don't we just drop a nuke in Afghanistan? Look at all the people that are getting killed.
Because it was a terrible decition. It was the wrong thing to do,
Oh, okay.
and we recognize now that it's the wrong thing to do. But
All right.
by
I'm
the way,
glad we're on the same
but
page
as
on
Cenk
this.
said, we're on the same page as to the ultimate righteousness of the decision, but not in the same place as to what was in the minds of everybody making that
All right,
decision.
we can disagree on that.
Yeah.
And at least we have Ben around now. Your dad might have died in
dad might
Japan.
Well, my dad was not set to go, but my uncle was set to go. He was.
Well, that's less relevant.
Oh, so you
Less
would
relevant.
maybe you
your
would have went.
cousins, I don't care as much about.
right. Totally. Yeah.
And I think that, look, the important thing, obviously, nukes are particularly scary because of the technology and the long-term ramifications of them. But the terrible thing about these bombings was the intentional targeting and destruction of civilians, which is terrible, whether it's firebombing or what happened in Dresden, or if it's drones today or carpet bombing from Ted Cruz. It's the willingness to kill civilians to accomplish your goals.
Right. Now,
And that's what terrorists do. That's
Exactly.
That's what terrorists are like. Hey, we have to kill some civilians, some babies, some old people, whatever. But we got a goal. And so that's exactly what we did.
And so it depends. Like, look, civilians get killed in war, and those same military people you talk to would all say civilians get killed in war, and sometimes war is necessary. But the question is, how callous are you about it, and how many? Like, literally, I mean, if you kill 10 civilians innocent in a war, it's terrible. If you kill 1 million, it's worse, right? But the bombings of Dresden, the fire bombings of Dresden and Tokyo,
Yeah.
Those were war crimes.
those stories are just the horror. I mean, they lit, fire bomb in Tokyo lit fountains on fire.
Yes.
With children playing in the fountains.
Yeah. So
Those were according to the Secretary of Defense during Johnson, I'm blanking out his name.
Robert McNamara.
He said that was a war crime.
Yeah, so let me end on those 2 points. So McNamara, who then went on to do terrible things in Vietnam, a lot of people don't know that he was the statistician for how many Japanese guys civilians we'd have to kill for them to bend, and et cetera, and how many bombs we'd have to drop. And he was the one who was in some ways orchestrating the firebombing of Tokyo. And he said later in his career in a documentary, well, if we had lost, of course, we would have been tried for war crimes because we were killing all their civilians, right? So now, on the other hand, look, it was a different time. Tens of millions of people died in World War II. So it was so much bloodletting that every option led to hundreds of thousands of people dying, including some or mostly civilians. So it's easy to look at it in hindsight and say they should have done this or they should have done that. And I share a lot of your passion on it, Jimmy, and because I want people to understand what happens when a nuclear bomb. Like, a lot of people just they make it like, oh, it's no big deal. No, when you drop the bomb, everybody in that area, babies, grandmothers, lit on fire. Okay. Incinerated. Okay, including our POWs. All those guys, they were all killed.
Koreans,
in the worst possible way.
conscripted to work for the Japanese, essentially enslaved Koreans, killed 30,000, something like that.
But in a world where we don't have a war killing tens of millions of people, dropping a nuke is unconscionable and weird and totally out of context and unthinkable. In a world where There's hundreds of thousands of people dying all the time, and we've got to end this goddamn war. It's a different world. It doesn't make it right? But it was a different context.
20 million Russians. 20 million Russians.
Yeah, people often forget that. And then the aftermath in China, of course. But the reason that we need to drive it home is that there are people today, politicians today, that think that all the progress we've had since then is bad. It's bad for us, and we should go back to those techniques. Firebombing is fine. If it's your enemy, they're not Americans, who the hell cares? That's why we need to continually reiterate how important it is that, as bad as drone casualties are, and we need to stop that, there are people who don't think that we should be using targeted weapons of that sort. They think we should just let loose and go crazy. And they're operating in the government now, not 75 years ago.